Well, it is morning on Star Lake, in my hot tub, with my coffee, and Kathleen Battle going in the background. Could anything have worked out better? What an incredibly perfect life. So let me talk now about what might make for a perfect life. I want to put together the thoughts from a book called Stages of Faith. And don't hang up on me now. The author, Jim Fowler, suggests that faith might have something to do with religion and spirituality, but it also could be the faith that a person has in science to create an ally against the chaos of life, and to explain what's going on that mostly seems unexplainable. So don't hang up just because I'm going to talk about a book called Stages of Faith. It doesn't have to be about religion. And then I want to also weave into it some thoughts of Werner Erhard. Pretty secular guy. Okay, so in Stages of Faith, in stage 3, a person's identity, sense of self, comes from the groups that they belong to. Very strong group identity and a strong sense of who you are by the group that you belong to. Then in stage 4, a person rejects that, does not want to be identified by a group, and now spends time in an individuative, introspective state of like, how did I come to believe the stuff I believe? How did I get here? A lot of thinking about that. Then a person will move on into stage 5, and now the person begins to get a sense of self from sort of a mystical sense. And a person will desire a sense of community with others, not a sense of identity from the group, but a sense of community with groups, all kinds of groups. But then comes stage 6, and I like to pat myself on the back that I might be a little bit into stage 5, but I don't know much about stage 6, but it looks to me like that a characteristic of stage 6 is that your identity now merges with a demand for justice, a demand for truth, a demand for righteousness, that things be done well for the poor, the downtrodden, etc. So the downside of moving on into stage 6 is you could end up dead, because your sense of identity with your body is less important to you than your sense of identity with the cause of justice and fairness and truth and freedom. Stage 6, people a lot of times don't last that long. Okay, so now let's work in something Werner Erhard was talking about 35 years ago. He suggested that we could create a distinction between force and power. Now you'll notice that people use those words as synonyms, but let's say they're not synonyms, that they are quite different phenomena. And let us say that force is something that you can acquire, that you can master, that you can practice. Force is something that you use to make your life more predictable, more safe, more productive, more profitable to you. And let us say that power is not something you can use. Power will use you. So this is an important distinction. Force is something you use. Power is something that will use you. So there's the expression that knowledge is power. No, we're going to create a distinction. Knowledge is force. Knowledge is something that you acquire, that you practice, that you master to make your life predictable and safe. Truth is power, and the truth will use you, and maybe not, well, I will say almost definitely not to your profit, not to your health. You will be used by the truth. All right. Where you want to go with this notion of stage 6, faith stage, and the notion of power as something that will use you would be this. It's a question of surrendering to power. And, you know, I don't think you have to be a religious person. There can be a sense that there's something ineffable, better go look that word up, ineffable, going on out here in our world and beyond our world and behind our world. That's the important part of an ineffable. There's something going on behind our world that you possibly could, well, I would say tap into, but that's more like force. No, that you could put yourself in the way of, that it might tap into you and put you to work for power. Now, you could say that about some nasty movements, you know, fascist movements that would tap into you and use you, but no, what we're looking at is it needs to be something that does not use force, something that invites people, that lifts people, something that is the wind beneath all our wings. Okay, now, how to surrender? Now, it's interesting that the word Islam does mean that. It means to surrender. So there's something very valuable in a notion that these folks came across in 700 AD. Surrender to Allah. But we're, 21st century, and what we want to surrender to are social movements of liberation and justice and freedom. So how does one do that? Well, I think that you need to take a look at the Buddhist Eightfold Path: right thoughts, right actions. There's all kinds of right ways of being in that Buddhist Eightfold Path. But any of our religious traditions have suggestions on how to quiet oneself, and that really has got to be the key. Is how does one get quiet enough that whatever power is out there that harmonizes with your internal being, that power can find you and use you and be active out there in the world. There's a story about that a little village in Italy had a statue of the Christus, and during the bombing, the hands were blown off of this statue. And so the village got together to decide, what shall we do about getting hands for the Christus? And it was proposed, don't replace the hands. Let the Christus remain without hands to remind us that he has no hands except yours.